chapter of INTACH. Let me begin by welcoming and thanking each of you who's joined us today in these rather unusual and troubled times. I do hope that all of you and your dear ones are keeping well and safe. Our thoughts go out to all those who are suffering due to the effects of the pandemic and wish those who are unwell a speedy recovery and return to some semblance of normalcy. With this scenario, we had started online talks last May since the first lockdown, and we complete a cycle of a full year with today's program. Just a brief about INTACH, an acronym for the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. INTACH was set up 37 years ago in 1984 as a non-profit organization with a vision to spearhead heritage awareness and conservation in India and to protect India's vast, unprotected built, cultural, natural, and intangible heritage. INTACH today is recognized as the largest heritage organization in India with over 200 chapters across the country. At Chennai chapter here, we have through programs and initiatives been creating awareness about the significance of our heritage. I take this opportunity to express my heartfelt gratitude and acknowledge the remarkable contribution made by Tara Murli, who is retiring as co-convener of Chennai chapter. She has been much more than a co-convener through all these years, an absolute pillar of strength. We are hopeful, Tara, that you will continue to be a guiding force going forward. I'm happy to introduce today our two new co-conveners, Rani Vedamuthu and A.S. Divakar. Rani Vedamuthu, currently Dean, School of Architecture and Planning, Anna University, has recently been appointed Registrar of Anna University. She is member of Indian Institute of Architects Council and the Tamil Nadu government nominee to the Council of Architecture. Divakar is an entrepreneur and among the pioneers of desktop publishing in Madras. Adding a different dimension is his passion for table tennis. He has served on the Tamil Nadu Table Tennis Association and as international referee in world championships. A photojournalist, his interests span history, culture, conservation, textiles, music, and temple art. Welcome to both of you, Rani and Divakar. Together, we hope to take INTACH's mission forward. Divakar, if you're here, you can just say.
Yeah.
Okay. Rani, has she joined yet? Maybe she's yet to join. A special welcome to our speaker, Kai Weise, architect and conservation architect, who's joining us from Nepal. We are delighted to learn of his Tamil Nadu connections. He was a student of Kodaikanal International School in 1982 and was on the school council from 2014 to 19. And he also received the Reach Award in Chennai in 2019. He will share his experience today on a critical aspect that we need to focus on, safeguarding religious heritage, the devastation caused by earthquakes, which is linked to loss and trauma, and therefore makes rehabilitation of places of worship and restoring it to the community an absolute priority. I welcome Badri Seshadri, who will present his observations after the talk. And welcome to Arun Menon from IIT Madras, with whom we had a joint program some years ago where Kai Weise was the speaker. May I request Diwakar to introduce Kai Weise, please?
Thank you, Sujata.
I think Rani is just joined. Rani, can you identify yourself? Maybe she will later. Yeah. Go ahead, Diwakar.
Thank you, Sujata. Kai Weise is a Nepali national of Swiss origin. He completed his master's in architecture from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich, in 1992, and has been working as a planner and architect in the Himalayan region. Kai Weise has been involved in facilitating the establishment of management systems for World Heritage properties, such as for Cappendu Valley and Lumbini in Nepal, Samarkand in Uzbekistan, Bagan in Myanmar, worked on the mountain railways of India, and is presently involved in Muruvu in Myanmar. Kai Weise was mentor for the second cycle of periodic reporting on the application of the World Heritage Convention of Cultural Properties in South and Central Asia. He is presently the president of ICOMOS, Nepal. After the Gorka earthquake of 25th April 2015 in Nepal, Kai Weise was responsible for coordinating culture sector response and helped establish the Earthquake Response Coordination Office at the Department of Archaeology. He was again involved in the strategic response and rehabilitation planning and coordination after the Chauk earthquake of 24th August 2016 in Myanmar. Mr. Kai Weise, we are all ears for you.
Probably Rani is now here.
Yeah, I'm here. Good evening to everyone, and thank you, Sujata, for those words of introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Rani.
We can't hear you, Carl. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, let me see. Okay. Just a second.
Okay. Yes, now I am unmuted. Thank you. Share my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me properly. Good evening, and it's an honor to be here and presenting to all of you. My presentation is on the vulnerability of our heritage. I'll be focusing on religious heritage to hazards, mainly focusing on earthquakes, and more or less talking about the lessons learned from the earthquakes in Nepal in 2015 and Myanmar in 2016. My presentation will have 4 parts. The first is an introduction to disastrous management for cultural heritage, sort of an overview, and then going on to lessons from the 2015 Gorka earthquake, lessons from the 2016 Chauk earthquake in Myanmar, and then some points in connection with procedures for safeguarding religious heritage. So my first section is Introduction to Disastrous Management for Cultural Heritage. I'm sure a lot of you already know a lot about this topic, but I did, as an introduction, want to go through some of the basic theory, which then will help explain what I will be talking about in my next sections. First of all, starting right from the beginning of what is heritage, I think this is quite important to sort of understand my understanding of heritage is something from the past of value and worthy of preservation. So there are three parts to this, and one is something from the past, and it can be any time in the past. It doesn't have to be 100 years and older, as a lot of legal documents say. I mean, it can be anything, even from a few years back, which is of value and needs to be preserved. And the question of value here is again something which is very complicated, because value is linked to certain probably subjective understanding of these objects, and something that might be a value of a certain community might not be valuable for others. However, that's why we need to really understand in what context are we looking at heritage. There are basically two main categories of heritage. One is, of course, cultural, the other natural. And within cultural, we have tangible, intangible. The intangible would include sort of knowledge, beliefs, skills, crafts. And the tangible, we talk about immovable and movable. The immovable would be the sites, landscapes, built heritage, archaeology, and the movable would be cultural artifacts, usually also linked to sort of museums. And of course, these cultural artifacts are usually also on site until they're displaced or removed. However, if we look at these different categories, we often find all these categories together. So on any given heritage site, we usually have all these different categories, and we cannot just look at one single category. So if we're looking at a heritage site, we cannot only look at built heritage. We have to look at the artifacts, we have to look at the intangible aspects of it, as well as sort of the context within it, within which the heritage is located. Now, coming to disaster risk management, we're basically looking at hazards and vulnerabilities of the heritage, which together produce sort of the risk that we're looking at. So when we talk about hazards, we're talking about earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, storms, winds, weathering, pandemics, fires, over or misuse of heritage or vandalism. And if we sort of categorize them, we have, of course, sort of natural hazards, human-induced hazards, and some could be sort of both. For example, fires and pandemics, it's sort of a bit of a mix of both human and natural. But we need to really understand what hazards we're talking about. And it's also important to understand that we usually don't look at hazards as singular hazards. There are usually multiple hazards that function together. For example, if we have an earthquake, it usually follows, it can follow with a tsunami, depending on the location of the earthquake, or there might be fires. We have storms that lead to floods. And very often it's also then linked to human hazards, linking to the natural hazards. And we really need to understand the complexity of it. The other component or sort of aspect that we need to understand is that hazards can be instant, for example, like the earthquake, or it can have a slow effect, like with weathering. And both of them will have negative impacts on the heritage. And we need to, of course, understand how these hazards function, how they impact the heritage, and deal with them respectively. Now, the vulnerability component is the degree of susceptibility of being negatively affected by the hazard. So the vulnerability of any cultural heritage is directly linked to the hazard that we're actually considering. And so it can have different aspects would need to be looked into, whether it's structural vulnerability, whether it's linked to material or the use of the heritage. And this assessment of the vulnerability is probably one of the key aspects of disaster risk management. And we have risk. So the risk is the probability of the hazard actually occurring and the impact it would have. The risk of a disaster occurring. So a hazard itself, so like an earthquake in itself is not a disaster. It's the effect it has to a heritage site that is vulnerable and the negative impact that it has. So we need to look at sort of the entire complexity of this circumstance of the hazard itself and the vulnerability of the cultural heritage and the risk that there is of a disaster occurring. Now, to reduce this, this risk, we can either reduce hazard or the vulnerability. A lot of hazards we can't reduce. You know, for example, an earthquake occurs and we can't really do much about it. However, you know, with some of the other natural hazards, there is, of course, it's linked to sort of more like macro planning. Flooding, it's always linked to maybe, you know, what kind of a drainage system we have. It might be linked to deforestation, you know, watershed management. So these natural hazards are linked to sort of really large-scale planning that we need to consider. While human hazards are much more sort of connected to the local circumstance, which can be dealt with through management or security. For example, in connection with the misuse of a site, it's linked to how do we manage the site, while you know, any kind of theft or you know, misuse can also be linked to you know, added security of the site. So the question is, how do we actually reduce the hazard on the one hand, and the question of vulnerability. So to reduce vulnerability depends on the heritage. For example, you know, the structural stability we're looking at in connection with aspects of like earthquakes. And then we have protection of materials, use, the resilience of the communities, especially in connection with intangible heritage. And this all links to preparedness. Now, in connection with preparedness, we really have to understand that we need to learn from the past, because hazards are usually recurring. It's, you know, the same hazard would have occurred in the past. Where you have earthquakes, you generally have had earthquakes in the past. And traditionally, these hazards have been dealt with in some manner. And we really need to understand how was it dealt with in the past and learn from it. However, we of course also have new issues arising, and that's one of the challenges of climate change, where, you know, major certain circumstances are changing, and we need to adapt and be able to deal with these new challenges that are arising. However, again, with a lot of these aspects, we really need to understand exactly what the implications are and where do these, you know, where does the challenge for reducing the risk lie. Now, once the disaster does occur, very often there is a certain impact, and the first period would be the question of how do you respond to it, which then leads to you know, a longer term rehabilitation. Now, in theory, we can, you know, break these down, these sort of periods down into smaller sections, but I think looking at it in a practical way, I've seen that, you know, we really have to look at it in these two broad periods of response right after the disaster, and then sort of looking at it in a longer term of rehabilitation. So we really have to understand that response is short term, you know, with a defined time frame. to carry out temporary measures to save lives and property. For example, it's linked to search and rescue, salvage, propping, covering, providing security to the site. And one has to really understand that the response should be time defined. And here the problem is very often that we don't define what the response period is, and it sort of lingers on. And we never get to the rehabilitation phase, which is sort of this long-term thinking of, which might not even be defined within a defined time frame, to carry out measures to improve resilience and reduce vulnerability, which is sort of an ongoing process, and which links to rehabilitation of tangible heritage as well as the intangible. So we really have to link the intangible, which then brings the communities into the discussion. What really needs to be understood here is that there's a clear transition from the response phase to the rehabilitation phase. And this is a critical step because, I'll come to this again in my examples, but very often we talk about response, and there's a lot of money in, being spent in response, emergency response. Even if you look at the UN agencies, all those agencies dealing with emergency response, they're the ones with lots of money. There's a lot of backing. They have a lot of, media support, while those trying to work on the long-term rehabilitation and, sort of reducing vulnerability and talking about resilience, they're the ones who don't really have sufficient resources. And we really need to give, the response phase a definite cut and saying, okay, the response phase will be ending on this day, and we will, look into long-term rehabilitation after this. I'll come back to this because I think this is one of the very important steps in the recovery process. Now, coming to my two examples, the first one was the 2015 Gorka earthquake in Nepal. I was in Nepal at the time, and I actually never really was considering, becoming an expert on disaster risk management. I was more looking, dealing with the management of cultural heritage. But now with the experiences of the past few years, I've really had to deal with these circumstances in a very practical manner. So the first one was, again, the 2015 Gorka earthquake, which impacted the Cappendu Valley, which is a World Heritage Site. So my example will also be in connection more on the World Heritage Site, which I've been involved with preparing the management plan. And just as a short introduction, the Cappendu Valley was inscribed in 1979, one of the early sites to be inscribed on the World Heritage List. It's made up of 7 monument zones, the 3 main centers or Durbar squares of Cappendu, Patan, and Bhaktapur. Then we have the 2 Buddhist stupa complexes of Swayambhu and Bodha. And then we have the 2 Hindu temple complexes of Pashupati and Changunarayan. And I got involved after the Cappendu Valley was put on the danger list due to uncontrolled growth and loss of historic fabric. So in 2003, Cappendu Valley was put on the danger list. I worked on establishing the management plan, and it was taken off the danger list in 2007. We continued working on the management plan until, the Gorka earthquake struck in 2015, causing a lot of damage to actually all of these 7 monument zones. We cannot really predict earthquakes, but we can, sort of be prepared. And in this process, here we have a map of earthquakes that have been mapped along the Himalayas. And this was an interesting, article written by Roger Bilham, which sort of motivated us to actually work on the preparation process, because this article more or less explained that there was a slip deficit, meaning towards Western Nepal, which means that you really didn't have enough movement, or there hasn't been an earthquake there since 1505, and there was a slip deficit, which means that there's a larger chance that some kind of movement will take place there. The dotted line is more or less the position of Cappendu. And we also know that earthquakes have occurred every 80 to 100 years that have affected Cappendu. And the last large earthquake that affected Cappendu was in 1934, which means we sort of started doing the calculations and saying, 80 to 100 years, it's going to be, our countdown time will begin. So already, from 2010 onwards, we did a lot of different workshops, and we started sort of preparing for the earthquake with symposiums. And a lot of this work was done together with Ritsumeikan University in Tokyo. And some of you might know Rohit Jigyasu, who was the UNESCO chair there. And we worked on a lot of different aspects of also linking it to community, involvement in disaster preparedness. And in 2013, we organized this Revisiting Kathmandu Symposium, sort of in preparation for this 80 years since the 15th January 1934 earthquake. And so it was like, okay, it's going to be 80 years. We're going to, probably the countdown is going to begin. We're going to prepare, be prepared for it. And it was interesting, of course, that it was also the 50 years since the Venice Charter, 20 years since the Nara document. So it was sort of a kind of an auspicious period to start rethinking our position. And so we were starting to look at how do we actually prepare for this earthquake that might take place in the next 10, 20 years. And this workshop was, which we organized, also actually it was through ICOMOS Nepal with the support of UNESCO. There's a document which one can download on our discussions. And this was really interesting because we were seriously preparing for an earthquake, and we actually, we weren't quite sure how to deal with this. And what we did was we discussed on sort of 4 different aspects of heritage and tried to understand the interlinkages. One was a discussion on authenticity, and I think that's always a very complicated discussion. However, linking it to management of heritage, how the communities are involved, and then bringing this into the discussion on earthquakes. Now, how does the communities link up with preparing for the earthquakes? How does the management plan deal with that? And what are we looking at in respect to authenticity, where we've had earthquakes in the past causing a lot of destruction, which a lot of our monuments have been rebuilt and restored over time. And in these circumstances, how do we actually, deal with the discussion on authenticity? And I'm not going to go much further into these discussions, but it's in the publication, and it can be downloaded, or you can ask me, I can send you the link. Anyway, to our surprise, within 15 months of our symposium, the earthquake did strike. And the first thing I thought was, yes, this is what we've been talking about, but are we really ready for it? And very clearly, we were not. We had sort of started our discussions, but there's been a lot that we should have done before the earthquake that we never managed to do. A lot of things we never really understood before we actually experienced the earthquake. And that led to a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of mistakes that we made. So the earthquake, of course, caused a lot of damage, especially to the heritage sites. We have more or less, for example, this monument, the Kastamandap, it collapsed. There was a blood donation going on that Saturday, just a few minutes before noon. And, there was a lot of fatalities in connection with this monument and actually several other historical monuments. And the question here has always been, how would we have prepared for this? Had we had known, what were the critical aspects of this? One was, the interesting aspect was that, the response to the disaster was, I believe, quite exemplary. And we had the community members, the local communities coming in and helping. We had, the armed forces. The coordination also worked very well. We made a few mistakes. They brought in sort of heavy equipment, which then we were able to stop the use of like these excavators on the site, which not only did they damage the material that could have been reused, but of course they were actually threatening the lives of any person who was still buried underneath. Very quickly after we got organized, we were able to sort of map out the damage. This is one of the monument zones, the Hanuman Dhoka Durbar Square in Cappendu. And as you see, the yellow is damaged, the red is fully collapsed. A large part of the monument zone was affected. And the question really was also in connection with the damage. So the yellow part was even more difficult to deal with because it needed to be protected and propped, and we were not really sure how all that functioned. We were not prepared to do that kind of work, and that's again one of these aspects that would have required training before the earthquake took place. One of the interesting little projects that we had was this shrine near the Swayambhu stupa. It's called Shantipur, and it's a tantric shrine where only the initiated priests can actually go in, and that's also once a year on a special occasion after doing various rituals. And this structure, which is actually quite a plain, simple structure, was quite badly damaged, and the inner walls had collapsed. Now, in the front vestibule, we had mural paintings. Now, in this front, the first level of the shrine, we were allowed to enter, and we were able to more or less remove whatever remained of these mural paintings, and they were taken to the museum and conserved with the help of a expert from Italy. But the problem was that the inner shrines, no one was allowed to go in. And we had all kinds of theories that we set up of how could we actually help restore this without even going in. The two gentlemen there, they were previously involved in fixing the roof, and they had been given special rituals, and they were allowed to go in, and actually not through the door, but they had to sort of crawl in from the roof even after their initiation. So it really was something very complicated because of the belief that no one who was not initiated can go in. Now, we were looking at possibilities of covering the entire structure and only working on it from the outside, but we had no idea whether the inner rooms had mural paintings or not. We really didn't know how to deal with it. And in the end, to tell you the truth, we gave up, and the local community themselves they got their local workers, and they started rebuilding the inner walls. And here we see that they had their own design. They did add some timber elements. They were saying that the roof might be a bit too heavy after it was restored, and they're working on it, using mud mortar, the traditional material, with added framing to support the roof. Now, it was interesting that there was no way that we could deal with it. We had all kinds of experts, international experts, who were interested in supporting this process. But in the end, it's really the local community, especially also because of the circumstance of this tantric temple being off limit to us, that the local community had to deal with it themselves. And very often that really is the ideal situation if they have the knowledge and the capacity to do it. And I think that is something that needs to be worked on and taken much more seriously. Now, what some of the lessons that come out of this Gorka earthquake was that we had no national policy in connection with the cultural sector. It was very unclear who was responsible for what. We, of course, had the Department of Archaeology as sort of the main authority, but then with local governance and also in connection with post-disaster reconstruction, the funding that was dependent a lot on, of course, international involvement. There was the policy was lacking, and I think that was one of the major problems we had faced right from the beginning. Then we had post-disaster conservation guidelines. I was involved in preparing them after the earthquake. We should have had them before the earthquake, but luckily we got it adopted quite soon. However, the procedures were not adopted. So we had guidelines, but the procedures became a problem in connection with how do we actually get the experts, the contractors involved, the artisans. We don't have a system for the artisans to work. They had to be tendered, the projects had to be tendered out. And that really caused a lot of problems where contractors would bid who had no idea of how to work on these projects. And the artisans would not get the work because the traditional artisans are very much more expensive than just probably the normal ones that the contractors use. Now, the other sort of aspect was the disaster, post-disaster needs assessment, which is sort of the basis for international involvement, which was spearheaded by World Bank as well as UNDP. This post-disaster needs assessment was prepared, within 2 months of the earthquake, based on very rough estimates. And the total amount that was calculated that was required for the culture sector was $207 million. Again, we had, this was just linked to funding, but what was the mechanism actually to implement this? That was never really dealt with. And we had a lot of problems where we had projects with, certain amounts, whether it was, some were 5 lakh, 10 lakh, 20 lakhs. You had, and then you had 50 crores. There was 1-2 crores and up to around 20 crore projects. And each of these were just tendered out without really understanding what was the requirement and without detailed planning of these projects. 1 year later, there was a post-disaster response framework prepared. This was a document that was published by the National Reconstruction Authority, but probably no one even read the document. And there was, if we look at some of these projects, the intent might have been correct, but there was very clearly some of the outcomes were inappropriate in connection with our sort of understanding of heritage conservation. And these are the kind of things that would have needed to be clarified, possibly before the disaster took place. And in the chaos after the disaster, it was very difficult to keep all these things under control. The other aspect is, of course, that we have a disaster site. Very often it's linked to community involvement, participation. Here we are looking at communities trying to reclaim their heritage, which has been destroyed. And this really needs to also be looked into in this process. So a monument is not only just a pure monument where we are looking at the material reconstruction of the structure, but it's also linked to sort of the belief of the communities and the whole intangible aspects that are linked. And here you can see the more or less the foundations of the Kasta Mandap that was excavated by archaeologists and the community outside doing a ritual once they realized how important this monument was, since the investigations into the foundation showed that they were from the 7th century, sort of 3 centuries older than what we expected it to be. And also you can see that the central part is divided into 9 squares. There was various aspects of the structure, which then suddenly became to be sort of reinterpreted by the communities. And this is still sort of an ongoing process while it's being reconstructed. The other aspect very clearly is sort of the intangible aspects. And here we see, this is the Seto Machendrana Chariot Festival that takes place every year. And, in all the main cities, we have chariot festivals. And after the earthquake, we had to make sure that the chariot festivals continued. And even though the streets were blocked with, still with rubble, and we had, supports on the buildings, we had to make sure that these, this chariot festival did take place. And it had to be ensured that the streets were cleared for the chariot, and it became very important in connection with this recovery phase. So we're really, when we talk about recovery and post disaster, we have to go back and look at the communities and what their needs are, and sort of the trauma that they felt, the loss. How are they going to deal with this? And very often it is that things are normalized, and it takes longer to probably reconstruct the monuments and the structures. But these festivals, they were able to continue. Actually, in the same year, we had this chariot festival was undertaken. Now, again, in connection with the monuments, we are looking at not only sort of the material aspects. So we had to salvage a lot of materials that were actually, again, are being reused in the reconstruction. But then we also need the artisans who are able to actually reconstruct the monuments. And without the artisans, without the skill and knowledge, the traditional skill and knowledge, we wouldn't really be able to reconstruct in an appropriate manner. And the 2 images below has been an interesting sort of a process that we've been going through in connection with the reconstruction of the Kasta Mandap, where we've been doing sort of really high-end research together with universities in the UK. On the left, we can see Professor Simpson from Stirling University in Scotland. He's taking samples of the wood to identify, well, do the dating as well. And our head carpenter, who is actually responsible for the reconstruction, he's looking at this very skeptically, sort of trying to, trying to bring this communication between sort of the scientists and the experts and the engineers and the traditional artisans well, it's still ongoing, and it's still a very complicated process because the language is different and the whole approach is different. For example, on the lower right side, our head carpenter, he's trying out this resistometer, which tests the wood. This, I mean, as a traditional carpenter, he usually just knocks on the wood and he'll be able to tell you whether it's rotten inside or not. However, if we don't know how to deal with that and we don't have the skill and knowledge, we need the equipment to do it. So it has been interesting to, for him to use this equipment and to try to bring up this dialogue between sort of this high-end science and engineering, and link that to the traditional knowledge and the skills. Now, the second example has been the 2016 choke earthquake. So a year later, after I was been dealing with the Cappendu earthquake, suddenly we had an earthquake in Myanmar. And at the time, I was already working on the World Heritage nomination of Bagan, working on the management plan for Bagan. And so we had, so Bagan here, again, this is a huge landscape where we have, over 3,000 monuments. And with each of these monuments are again linked to associated ornamentation. We have archaeological deposits, and it's really linked to sort of a very strong, largely Buddhist culture, and with as mentioned, over 3,500 monuments. Now, when the earthquake occurred in 2016, it wasn't too large an earthquake, and the impact really was only on the heritage site in Bagan. And the interesting point was, okay, how do we respond? So within, I think, 15 minutes of the earthquake, I get a phone call saying there's been an earthquake, it's impacted Bagan, what do we do? And this was very interesting because, again, after having, prepared for earthquakes for probably, 9 years, when someone asks you, there's been an earthquake, what do we do? It's not an easy answer, to give. And what we did was, I was in Cappendu, so of course I couldn't visit the site immediately. It took me, 2 days to get there. The immediate response was that we prepared a short write-up on the do's and don'ts of, in connection with this immediate response. And we prepared this together with some colleagues and got it translated overnight into Myanmar. And, it was sent to Bagan the next morning. So the next morning, when the president of Myanmar arrived in Bagan, I presume he wasn't quite sure what to say, and he was given these notes that we had sent there, and he read out our do's and don'ts in front of everyone, which then was sort of the basis of how the response took place in Bagan. So it became, I would say, quite exemplary how this whole sort of response and rehabilitation began in Bagan. And the next day, State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi also arrived. And she also again said, don't rush into the response. We have to take it step by step, and we need to also seek assistance from, UNESCO and the experts that we work together on this. And I think this was one of a really interesting moment where we realized that we don't even have anything written up, saying, okay, what are the do's and don'ts of this immediate response phase after the disaster. And we had to actually prepare it right there and then. And luckily, we got it done and translated and sent there. Over the next few weeks, we mapped out the damage, and we found that there were 389 monuments that were affected by the earthquake, 36 sort of the higher priority. Priority 2 was 53, and priority 3, there were the largest number was 300 of them. So we again had to start looking at how do we approach this response and rehabilitation phase. And so I came in with my experience from Cappendu, and where in Cappendu it didn't quite work out as planned, I was able to introduce it to Bagan, with a clear plan right from the beginning. So we said the response phase will be 3 months. So the earthquake took place end of August, end of November. This was the response phase. All salvaging, protection, all the sort of temporary activities will be done within these 3 months, and we move on to the rehabilitation phase, which would be sort of a prioritized phase for 2 years, so that we can sort of plan out also the funding for these 2 years. And it was also, of course, our World Heritage nomination was going on. So we had to sort of coordinate it and explain, make sure that we are really in control of the heritage site, saying, yes, there has been damage, but the management system is in place, and very clearly, it's not going to impact the World Heritage nomination process. And then the overall rehabilitation management was, 5 years plus. We didn't really want to, again, hurry and have a clear, defined rehabilitation period, but that there could be further planning done. We looked at a 5-year plan. An interesting aspect that, observing the damage that took place was that if we look at older photographs, we already saw that which was damaged was often things that had been reconstructed later. So these were inappropriate interventions that were very often done with using different materials. For example, cement, mortar. In one case, it was actually even reinforced concrete. And as soon as the monument shook, these added elements, which were clearly foreign, not only in respect to it being more newly built, but even in connection with its material characteristics, these elements fell off again. So one can clearly see that there were inappropriate interventions carried out. And the question was, how do we deal with this now in the future? In this response phase of 3 months, we tried to make sure that as many of the monuments were protected, provided protection. These are huge monuments, and it was very clearly not easy. Arun Menon was there helping out in connection with the structural aspects. We were just trying to, deal with the situation as best as possible, and provide whatever protection that was possible immediately. And one of the things was also in connection with prioritizing the response. Now, in connection with looking at rehabilitation, we were looking at, out of these 378 389, there was, we calculated about 100 monuments needed sort of special planning and restoration work done. And so initially we planned it out that we could look at, over this 5-year period, that we'd look at 20 monuments per year. However, the point really was that we start with the less complex monuments. And sort of the easiest ones we do immediately, while we look at these more complex ones over time, because it required further research and also sort of a bit of a trial and error in connection with how to deal with this. So this was sort of the concept that we developed, just to give it a kind of a framework. I believe it didn't quite work out exactly in this manner. However, the framework did, was accepted, and it did help sort of coordinate the work. The other aspect was, these conservation guidelines in respect to the post-earthquake activities. So there was one aspect, again, these are all temples and so have some kind of religious significance. However, some were actively used with temple, pagoda trustees looking after them, while there were a lot of monuments that were not sort of in active use. And within these, we have monuments that were of the original material, while we also had a lot of monuments that were rebuilt, in some cases rebuilt using cement mortar, which were, interestingly, most of the damaged monuments were actually rebuilt structures out of using cement mortar. And we had to set up conservation guidelines, also, of course, dealing with these rebuilt structures, but ensuring that the original, the structures that, of the original material, that they were, of course, given priority. The inactive monuments, we could really look in connection with conservation, sort of the very Western approach to conservation as monuments. However, the monuments that were in active use, where we had, pagoda trustees, where there was regular rituals going on, those monuments had to be restored. They could not be kept in sort of any kind of damaged form. So we had to have a separate category for these sort of active monuments. No one really liked the names inactive and active, but we never really figured out what best to call them. But anyway, these monuments that were actually being used for religious purposes with a religious community linked to it, they had to be restored. And any damage that occurred had to be replaced. And we had, this was the sort of a more complicated process, where they were, of course, in a hurry to get their monuments back in shape. And so we needed a whole separate set of guidelines for these monuments. And a separate category that I added was historical buildings, which were more or less from the, most of them were from the colonial period. However, no one really was interested in these. And I think there were only a few of us architects who were, saying, yes, these are also very important monuments. And we also need to make sure that we, provide them protection. But again, these were not religious monuments. And so they were also not linked to that same sentiment. And especially since they were colonial buildings, there was even less sentiment there to provide them any extra protection. Sorry, yeah. And as a last point in connection with this process, we had to ensure that the community was allowed to participate. We had people from all over Myanmar come to Bagan to help as volunteers. Initially, again, we were saying, slow down, we first need to document, we have to do it carefully. You cannot just come in and start clearing up the site. However, it was very difficult to stop them. So we, in a certain sense, we had to sacrifice at least one or two monuments For us, it was a sacrifice, but this was really that the community could get involved and provide their voluntary service. And, you know, thinking of it afterwards, I don't think it really had too much of a negative impact. And the community really got involved, and it was, you know, their contribution to Bagan, which is so important to all people in Myanmar. And this had to be allowed. And on the other hand, we had local donations. So you had, you know, sort of over $4 million. We had 1 million for, you know, I think altogether we had $5 million that were collected from the local communities. And it was not only, you know, sort of the community coming to provide their services, but also, you know, financial support given to the reconstruction efforts. Now, after these two examples, there are just a few points that I'd like to raise. There's no, you know, it's sort of what would this procedure be for safeguarding religious heritage, linking it to, of course, the disaster risk management. Just in connection with our understanding of heritage, I think we also have to understand that things are changing. Our understanding of heritage is changing. And where in the past we were looking at sort of exclusive heritage, sort of, you know, the monuments and palaces, we're looking at, today we're looking at more of it being inclusive, such as cities, landscapes, and, you know, where the community is part of the heritage. And this brings with it a totally different understanding and approach to how we deal with heritage. The other is, of course, the management. It has always been very authoritarian, where you put a fence around your heritage and say, okay, this is now protected. And that cannot be done, like, you know, in connection with like landscapes and cities and sort of the living heritage. So how does one deal with a more democratic approach to managing these sites? And the other is in connection with authenticity. And I think we always talk about authenticity in connection with, well, the NARA document says truthful and credible expression of value. And the question is, you know, what is truthful? You know, truthful is a very sort of an absolute word, even though probably each of us have a different understanding of what truthful is. However, probably it has to be credible. It has to be credible to everyone. We need to really understand authenticity in connection with something that is credible, which is acceptable to especially the communities and the stakeholders of the heritage. Now, in connection with this understanding, we have both response and rehabilitation. In the response period, we have like the first responders, whoever is around at the moment. We have the community, we have search and rescue, army, police, NGOs, activists, and we had basically the National Reconstruction Authority that was set up. However, in Cappendu, the National Reconstruction Authority was set up due to various complications, some 9 months after the earthquake, and they got involved not in the response, but in the rehabilitation, which has been a bit of an issue. In connection with rehabilitation, we're looking at long-term. So the responsible government authority together with related communities, and it has to focus on sustainability. And as I mentioned, you know, the National Reconstruction Authority would not be the body to deal with sustainability. You know, they're there to respond, to do something immediately. And once this, the involvement of the National Reconstruction Authority sort of extends on to 5 years, that's too long. Their activity is response, and they should really focus on response. Rehabilitation, government itself, the authorities have to deal with it, the communities have to be involved, and it has to be done in a sustainable manner, considering long-term planning. Again, the destruction. What was the main cause for the destruction? We had more or less the two main reasons was lack of maintenance and inappropriate interventions. It was not that the heritage was inadequate to withstand the earthquake. Some of our monuments withstood the 1934 earthquake, which was much larger. It was due to lack of maintenance and later the inappropriate interventions, especially using, sort of modern materials that is much stiffer and stronger. And so the question is, who is responsible? So on the one hand, in connection with maintenance, we're talking about the managers. We have to look at the managers. How are they maintaining the structures? And in our part of the world, maintenance is, I don't even think in the dictionary, let alone integrated into our planning. And the inappropriate interventions are our experts in, dealing with introducing, new designs and new materials. And we need to learn from it. Not all the interventions were wrong, but the interventions that did not, provide the correct sort of support to the monuments, or actually very often led to the destruction of the monument. We need to understand this and do further research on it. And in a lot of cases, we've actually gone the other way of saying, even the interventions were not sufficient. We have to actually, the interventions, we need to, increase the stiffness and the stability. And I'm sure Arun Menon can say more to that. The other part was in connection with preparedness and planning. So as I mentioned, the post-disaster needs assessment was prepared within 2 months of the earthquake. It was based on basic estimates, and after, based on this document, tenders were given out to restore monuments without any further planning. And I think, the international approach of, getting donors involved is through this PDNA process. But just by having this document that is prepared right in the beginning and not ensuring that there is further detailed, work and documentation and design carried out, has caused a lot of monuments being either the projects have been stuck, that they haven't really moved forward, or that the work that was done there was clearly inappropriate. The other was the whole concept of build back better. And I think everyone talks about build back better. And I think it's, of course, a great thing to build back better. But the question is, what is better? And I think there's been, without defining what better is, it becomes a problem where everyone has their own definition of better. And this has, again, caused a lot of complications where we have introduced new interventions to make our heritage better. And we're trying to make our heritage better. We're trying to make a world heritage better. Well, then, the thing is, what is better about it? What is lacking in our heritage that we need to make it better? And I think that is another big discussion that needs to take place, because with the wrong interpretation of what better is, it leads to complications, and the implementation of this concept is basically leads to inappropriate interventions. The other point, which is just an interesting point, was that a lot of our international agencies came in connection with debris management. So we have destruction, there is material lying around, and it needs to be removed. And this is a concept for modern cities, modern places where we have materials and the buildings are built out of materials that cannot be reused. But the point is that traditional materials are important resources. I mean, they're not debris. They have to be there, kept to be reused. And I think this whole concept of debris management, where, here it says, before and after images of where we have this huge pile of bricks and timber and things, and it's removed. That is the wrong approach in connection with our historical buildings and monuments. Now with resources, again, we are talking about human, financial, equipment, facilities. In connection with the response, very often whoever is around responds. We have international response with teams coming in. We have at the national level, we have the army, the police coming in. At every single level, everyone is involved in the response phase. Now, in connection with the rehabilitation phase, this suddenly changes. And I think this is why it's very important to differentiate between, having a clear differentiation between response and rehabilitation, where rehabilitation can only take place at the local level. They can, of course, support the local and state level rehabilitation process, but you cannot have international and sort of national level authorities coming in respect to rehabilitation. It has to be sustainable. And again, this is a checklist that we prepared. I'm coming to the end, just a few more slides. I see that it's gone slightly longer. We have, this checklist was prepared to make sure that we go through the entire process of preparation, design and planning and implementation. And I prepared it for Cappendu, making sure that whoever is responsible for each of these phases has to sign. So the authority responsible has to sign, and only once phase 1 is done, can you move on to phase 2. This didn't really work at all in Cappendu, while in Bagan, let's say it was adapted slightly, but I think the process itself was accepted. The concept was accepted. I think this becomes very important that, again, like I was saying, the rehabilitation process was not adopted, only the guidelines were adopted, which meant that we didn't have this process in place where we actually do the documentation, assessments, you carry out research, whatever is required. You have inventory of salvage materials, and we look at the temporary interventions before going on to designing how are you going to restore your structural interventions, conservation, materials, artisans, how are the artisans going to be involved? And then you actually prepare the implementation plan and then go on to the implementation, which is often with religious structures, we have rituals that have to also be done, where if a contractor is tendered, out the project, they don't carry out such rituals. I think this becomes very important, that this process is also fully understood and implemented, and someone is responsible and should sign for it. And the process, of course, also has to look at the immovable heritage, the movable heritage, and the intangible heritage, that we really have an understanding of all the different aspects of the heritage. This is something we're working on, and Pashupati Monument Zone right now, we're working on the master plan there. And we're working on guidelines for each of these aspects. And my final slide, we're looking at continuity and adaptation. So I think our whole concept, especially in connection with disaster risk management, is yes, we cannot always conserve everything, but we need to look at continuity. And for continuity, there has to be certain adaptations. Continuity means you carry out your festivals. Continuity means you make sure that your next generation, the kids, are also helping pull the chariot. And adaptation means that the wood carving is not only done by men, but also women. And here is an example of this young lady actually working on wood carving, which traditionally is not done. But considering, to ensure continuity, one needs adaptation, and these are the kind of things that we really need to look into. Thank you. Sorry, it went a bit longer. I was trying to keep my looking at my watch, but I think it did take a bit longer than planned. Thank you.
Hi, Badri. You should answer. Sujata, you're also on.
Thank you, Kai, for that wonderful presentation. May I request Padma to please take any questions that there are. Would anybody like to ask any questions?
You're tracking the YouTube channel to find out if there are any questions there.
If there aren't, I'll ask Badri to please give his observations. And before that, I'll just introduce Badri. Badri Seshadri is a co-founder of Tamil Heritage Trust, THT, which is involved in documentation and dissemination of Indian heritage. THT conducts programs such as talks, conferences and workshops on heritage, and organizes site visits to temples, museums, monuments, and historic places. And maybe Nepal will be on the agenda sometime. Badri is a mechanical engineer who graduated with a BTech from IIT Madras and a PhD from Cornell University. He co-founded Cricinfo, a cricket information portal currently owned by ESPN, and Kirakku Padipam, a leading Tamil book publisher. He is currently into software development. May I request Badri to make his observations, please?
Thank you, Sujata, and thank you, Kai Weise, for an outstanding talk. I mean, we have been so worried about the situation here, though we are, at least in south of India, not impacted as much by earthquakes. There's always a worry about massive rainfall causing damage, worry about tsunami, which has already happened, and we don't know if it would happen in future, and general apathy and road construction and nearby quarrying of large hills. So we have a lot of man-made disasters to also worry about, along with the natural disasters. But the principles that you outlined, the problems you outlined, they are things that we can directly relate to. There are many points that I have written down, but I'm not going to take much time. Just wanted to touch upon a few points that I could glean from your outstanding talk. One of the things that I see the commonality, if you are looking at India or Nepal or Myanmar, is that when these monuments were created, the communities were far wealthier and aware than what they are right now. For example, would we be so concerned about this if we are looking at the church at Notre Dame in Paris? There was a fire accident, and we know that it will be restored. It will be made just as good, hopefully, or even better, right? Enough research will go into it, enough funds will go into it. The local people will be sensitive to that, and they will always get the right people and not go to the lowest bidder in the tender, right? Because the local communities understand the value of it, they take pride in it, and that's the biggest worry that I see in the communities around here. There's a huge economic disparity compared to when, let's say, the great temples were built. You're talking 7th century, 9th century, 10th century. Those are the times of great wealth and technological advance in the societies for that time, the material, that's another great point that you brought in. Why are we using modern material? Because we have the modern people have that great value they assign to concrete. It's disastrous. And how will you go and tell somebody who lives in a concrete house, and that's their desire to build a bigger, larger concrete house? So don't apply concrete to this great, heritage site. They will not be able to understand that. But that's where the sensitization of the right material, the right approach to repairing and fixing various cultural monuments. This is going to be a huge challenge. And so there's one point that you talked about of community participation. Right? I can see that the community is participating in two major ways of participating in the rituals, participating by way of donating money or collecting money. But do they completely understand the wealth around them, the great monuments, the sophistication that was achieved at a certain point in time, and how to restore them if a disaster strikes? Because in Nepal, you are at the base of Himalayas, and earthquakes are something that you cannot stop. So something is going to happen tomorrow also. So beyond the rituals, do you have that the people, the local communities have that inherent understanding and appreciation of what needs to be protected and how they have to be protected? I see exactly the same problem here where we are. A lot of our structures, in fact, almost all the structures that we are talking about, which are protectable, are made of granite. So natural destruction is minimal. But yet, the reckless way in which our government-controlled process of sandblasting, water blasting, the way in which they are supposedly, the whole idea of actually improving them results in enormous destruction to the quality of the entire sculpture and architecture itself. How do we get this sensitivity all the way up to the local people, the government in particular, and the contractors? I'm really afraid of what is going to happen. But the effort that you have brought in terms of helping the communities to get their cultural heritage back post a disaster gives us a lot of confidence that over time we will also be able to get similar thought to the local people. Organizations like INTACH is doing an outstanding job, but always an uphill battle. And the more people get into this bandwagon of appreciating the cultural treasure that we are sitting in, then I think we will approach it much better. Right? Again, I will take the example of France. None of us is going to really worry about it. I think they will fix it. Now, that's a level that we need to reach. Be it Nepal or Myanmar or India, if we were to be hit with a natural disaster, it will be restored back, where none of us need to even fear about the quality and the outcome. It's just a short time frame after which everything will be fine. Now, that is the kind of a confidence that we all need to get. How do we make that happen is really the challenge, and that's where experts like you can help. Volunteers like us, we are just non-experts, just cultural enthusiasts. We would certainly like to add whatever value we can, guided by people like you and experts in INTACH. Thank you. So do you want to have an interaction if there aren't any
Padma?
questions?
Yeah, I think there's a question on the chat.
I have shared it with the
Would
Kai.
you like to read that out?
Yes, this is a question from Mrs. Uma Balu. As responsible citizens, without professional knowledge or experience, but a great interest in heritage and culture, how can we actively support in preserving our monuments? What is the level of interest among the public on initiatives like Monument Mitra?
Yes, it's actually quite a complex thing to try to understand who are the stakeholders, and in what are their different positions within this sort of a network linking it to the heritage. And of course, we have those who, in religious heritage, of course, the devotees, you have the priests, but then you also have the authorities at the different levels. You need to have those interested in the monuments as heritage. We have and then the question then starts coming of do we have the artisans who can actually deal with, let's say, the restoration of the stone monuments in your case, and the communities. What kind of interest do the communities actually have in preserving the heritage? And it's been interesting because after the earthquake, especially in Cappendu, we had, for example, on the one hand, we had a lot of activism. So we had, just in connection with the Kastamandap, there were plans of actually rebuilding it with sort of modern interventions, modern engineering used, and we had community activism and protests saying, no, we want our heritage back as it was. Now, it's really interesting because what was this as it was? We start needing to start discussing it, and that whole interaction of the requirement for research, the requirement for documentation, the requirement of coming together and discussing what is it that we actually want. And I think this process, which we can call activism or the community involvement, I think this becomes very important. And it can be, it doesn't have to be the experts. And we also saw that, a lot of the activists, they were not people who knew how this whole restoration, reconstruction was going to take place, but they knew that, the process was not correct and that process needed to be corrected. On the other hand, one of the first things that I realized was none of these monuments are going to be restored properly until we have the proper artisans. So where are the artisans? Who are the artisans? Do we have the traditional knowledge and the skills required? Because without them, we can talk and have the best theories, but it's never going to get done. And so we have to go back and make sure that we have those people who have the knowledge and skills to actually restore the monuments. But this has to go hand in hand with those who know how to, carry out the rituals, who know how to, deal with all the different aspects of the heritage, the intangible and the tangible aspects of the monument. And I think this becomes important. And once we have all the bits and pieces together, the chances of it working is much greater. Without the artisans, we can talk about it, but then we still have the contractors coming in. The contractors probably know how to work with cement and concrete. They probably don't know how to how to work with, carving stones and working with traditional technology. And we can never actually move forward without that. And I think in connection with the question, everyone who is interested can become someone who observes, who then becomes an activist, who can actually present, raise these questions. And, an organization like INTACH can surely, work towards facilitating this broader understanding. And it's sort of interesting. Of course, you have different disasters. I was just thinking of Mahabalipuram, which was impacted by the tsunami, and there were those floods. I think that was more on the Kerala side. A few years ago, I remember there was, it was a major disaster. So, with the tsunamis and floods, it might be different from the earthquakes, but the basic steps and the basic procedures that are required, we still need to follow the same process. And, I think some of this can be discussed further. And it could be that INTACH might be, organization that can bring some of these discussions together to move forward. Thank you.
I think Sunaina wanted to say something.
What is her ID? I'm just trying to.
Sunaina?
Naina. Okay. From Kodaikanal?
Yeah. Hi, Sujata. Thank you. Kai, thank you very much. It was a very interesting session. I live in Kodaikanal.
Oh.
And Sunaina Chowdhury, and the convener here for INTACH. And yeah, we have been working with KIS, with Corey, quite a lot.
Oh, that's good.
Okay. And yeah, so we have these churches and temples around here, and they keep doing, various kind of things to them, which when we try to object, they don't like it. So maybe when you come next time, we could try to work something out whenever you do come down here again. Yeah. So
yes, it's always difficult, and I think we should always try to be one step ahead and come with solutions and alternatives. And I think that's something that in our heritage field we're always behind, and I think that's the problem. We're always saying, no, don't do that, and wait, let me think, what might be a solution. No, we need to be ahead of them and come up with solutions and say, oh, why don't you do this? It would help, and try to convince the people. I think that's one of the things we really have to work on.
Remember the old cemetery that's over here?
Yeah.
So the pastor from the St. Peter's Church, they were planning to build a wall around the cemetery and build another church there. So because they said this church is not big enough for their, for their sermons and things. So we said, and which would mean cutting down trees, knocking down a lot of the old graves. So we went as INTACH. We went and we gave him a letter, and we appealed to him, and and it seems like it worked.
Oh,
so but we don't know how much longer everything will go on.
What's the solution for his huge congregation, and where are they going to collect? So I think a lot of these things is if we can find solutions which are more appropriate and which sort of resolves their problems, but then in a manner that is acceptable. I think that's what we really need to work on. Which requires, of course, much more involvement from our side, much more work, but that's to be successful in trying to deal with these situations. I think that's the only way.
Okay, thank you very much, and I think yes, we shall try to work that way. But anyway, please do get in touch when you do arrive here next. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
I don't know when that will be, but
yeah, I know that. yeah, thanks.
I request Rani Maria Vedamuthu to please propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sujata.
It's my pleasure to actually wrap up this session by proposing the formal vote of thanks. Thank you, Weise, for sharing your experiences and lessons learned in the safeguarding and rehabilitation of the living heritage structures post the 2015 Gorka earthquake in Nepal and the 2016 Chao earthquake at Myanmar. These living heritage structures are part of the cultural landscape of the place and are the hallmarks of cultural identity. And rehabilitation and restoration becomes a very complex process involving various authorities and agencies, experts, and more importantly, the communities and their resources. You've rightly pointed out that it is the lack of maintenance and inappropriate interventions which most often cause deterioration of these structures, heritage structures. Usually concrete and cement are seen by many restoration persons like, the contractors, etc., as quick fixes in the process of restoration. And this is a very sad state of affairs. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation and for the very important takeaways that we have at the end of this session. Thank you, Divakar, for introducing our speaker, and Sujata Shankar, convener of the INTACH chapter, and her team. Of course, I'm also in her team, for organizing this talk. Thank you, Badri Sheshadri, for your valuable comments and observations on the topic and the presentation. Also, many thanks to Padma for moderating the question and answer session, and thanking all the participants in this forum. And I wish you all a very good evening and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai. Thanks.